Sarah stood at the window, peering out at the trees swaying lazily in the morning air. Its leaves shimmered with all shades of greenery, and my heart felt especially warm from this simple but important sight. Suddenly, her gaze fell on the calendar hanging on the wall, and she instantly smiled, feeling a wave of happiness envelop her. An important day was marked on this calendar, the beginning of the vacation, for which she had been waiting for so long and for which she was preparing with special trepidation. It was a moment that knew no fuss, no routine, no worries. This moment was her own. Ahead lay a vacation with friends, fresh impressions, and long-awaited freedom from routine, from all those small chores that once seemed important, but now that the vacation was so close, they seemed insignificant, not worth the slightest attention. Sarah felt this anticipation, this wonderful feeling of absolute lightness, fill her more and more every day. She was immersed in thoughts about how good it would be to walk along the ancient streets of the city, have a delicious dinner at local restaurants, enjoy the company of loved ones and forget about time. It was like the resurrection of some long-lost lightness. And despite the fact that the vacation was only at the end of the month, it seemed to her that it had already arrived, that her soul and body were free from everything that connected them in everyday life. Immersed in her dreams, Sarah hardly noticed how on the other side of the window her husband, Thomas, approached her, slowly, as always with the very calmness that she loved so much in him. He wasn't in a hurry, he wasn't trying to win her attention, but his presence was always important. This was a man she had been through a lot with, a man she knew down to the smallest detail, whose habits and views had become a part of her own life. She trusted him unconditionally, believed in his feelings, and was confident that their relationship, despite all the difficulties, was solid. For her, he was someone who could understand her at a glance, who gave her a sense of stability and confidence. In her world, he was someone who couldn't hurt, who was always there for her, and she was firmly convinced of that. Sarah had no doubt that her life with Thomas was not just two people living under the same roof. It was a bond as strong as steel, held together by trust, shared dreams, and a desire to build a future. She couldn't imagine that she wouldn't trust him, that she would think about the fact that he was hiding secrets from her or living some kind of secret life. There were no lies or hidden meanings in his words, only sincerity and confidence. Everything she saw in their relationship was clear and understandable to her. She had never thought about things that could undermine her faith in him before, but lately she had begun to notice more and more how her attention to financial details was disappearing. This vacation, which she was so eager to go on, required certain expenses, and despite all their savings and the ability to pay for everything through credit cards, Sarah felt that her financial freedom began to depend on some new unknown resource. She began to feel that her expenses were increasing every day, and although it was related to her upcoming vacation plans, the thought of such reckless spending remained in her mind like a shadow. Maybe it was just an overspent credit card? Maybe it was the inevitable excitement before a vacation, when it seemed like everything had to be perfect. She tried not to pay attention, but she couldn't get rid of the strange feeling that was growing in her head. And so she returned to her husband again, watching him lean against the back of the sofa with a slight sense of satisfaction, and for her everything seems perfect, as before. She no longer noticed even the slightest worries, because this world full of promise was so familiar and cozy. Sarah continued to prepare for her vacation, planning every detail of her upcoming trip, but in the last few days, something elusive began to torment her calm. It wasn't something specific that could be caught and understood right away, but the feeling that something was going wrong was getting stronger. Thomas seemed to have become different, more detached, more closed. He continued to do everything he usually did, returning home on time, but his attention was distracted, and there was no longer the deep interest in his eyes with which he always watched her stories about upcoming plans. Sometimes Sarah caught his gaze on her, and it seemed to her that there was something ineffable, unclear in his eyes, which she could not understand, but which persistently disturbed her. One of those days, when she returned home from work, she felt something tense in the air. Thomas was sitting on the couch, immersed in reading a report that clearly did not require his immediate attention, as he looked up from it to repeatedly glance at his watch. Sarah felt strangely uncomfortable in his presence, as if all his movements had been slowed down and his words had become smaller and lighter, as if he wanted to avoid talking. "Are you home yet?" "What is it?" he asked, without looking up from his papers, which for a moment seemed unusually cold and mechanical to her. "Yes, as always," Sarah replied, approaching him a little uncertainly. She dropped her bag on the table and sat down next to him, feeling as if the air between them had become thicker. "Have you forgotten that we need to discuss the details of the vacation?" Thomas finally looked up, but his face was devoid of the smile she always saw when he listened to her, when they made plans together. Instead, he nodded quickly, muttering something unintelligible, and turned back to his documents. "Yes, of course, we'll figure it out," he said, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. This behavior alarmed Sarah. Once upon a time, Thomas always listened to her with interest, participating in the discussion of every, even the most insignificant issue. But now she felt that his thoughts were somewhere far away, beyond their conversation, beyond this house. She tried to ignore his aloofness, the coldness he suddenly radiated, but her anxiety wouldn't leave her. A few days passed, and the tension kept piling up. Sarah couldn't help but notice that every evening Thomas began to stay late at work. He said he had important things to do, but that explanation was heard too often not to arouse suspicion. It wasn't like before, when he was involved in household chores, when his return home was always something long awaited, but now, on the contrary, he left with incomprehensible reluctance, and his silence on his return was strange. Sarah found herself thinking that this important project was on his lips too often, and that he somehow carried this unclear burden on their relationship. One day, returning from work, Sarah decided to check her credit card statements. Incomprehensible transactions flashed on the computer screen, which she could not immediately connect with something familiar. Some of them were quite large amounts, and all of them led to an account that she could not identify. Curious, she clicked on the details, and then her gaze caught on the name Victoria. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a stranger, but who was she? Why did Thomas make payments to her account? Sarah didn't know how to react to what she saw. 1,000 thoughts swirled in her head, but she tried to stay calm. Maybe this is a mistake. Maybe it's just another business deal that she didn't know anything about. But the more she thought about it, the more vague and disturbing images appeared in her head. Who is this Victoria? And why is Thomas paying her such large sums? Does he pay only for services, or is there something more between them? Not daring to confront him right away, Sarah decided to wait, observe, and draw conclusions. That evening, after dinner, she tried to talk to him again. He was sitting at the table, sipping coffee, and despite his calm exterior, Sarah could sense his underlying nervousness, his desire to avoid direct questions. "Thomas, you often talk about some projects," she began, trying to articulate her thoughts so as not to betray alarm. "You're at work all the time. Why?" He put down the cup and looked at her again, but now there was not just coldness in his eyes, but something harder, as if he suddenly realized that she knew something. He hesitated, and the silence seemed endless to Sarah. "It's just a lot of work," he finally replied, but there was no confidence in his voice, but rather a distinct distance, as if he already knew that he would have to justify himself. "Are you sure it's as you say?" "What is it?" she asked cautiously. His gaze, which had always been open and sincere before, now seemed a little tense, and his lips were trembling slightly. But he smiled again. It was a cold smile that appeared too quickly, as if he was trying to hide something. "Yes, Sarah, it's okay, don't worry," he replied, but there was something unnatural in his answer that immediately alerted her. Sarah felt a chill run through her skin, and she knew that her intuition wasn't wrong. A lot of vague thoughts, fear and anxiety now wouldn't let go of her, and she decided that, despite all the doubts and indecision, she would need to go further, look for answers to her questions. Something in their relationship was starting to change, and she had to find out what it was. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, as always, but the morning light that used to bring her joy now seemed somehow dim and cold. She came into the kitchen, where Thomas was already drinking his morning coffee, engrossed in reading the morning news. At first glance, everything was as usual, his usual morning routine, his even voice when he greeted her, and his indifferent attention to her every move. But for Sarah, his indifference, his detachment were so vivid that they seemed to catch the eye, penetrating into the very soul. "Have you forgotten that we have a meeting with friends tonight?" she said softly, trying to bring the conversation back to normal, so as not to let herself lose her calm. Thomas nodded, but did not take his eyes off the phone screen, and his response was so matter-of-fact that Sarah felt her heart sink. His inattention was so palpable that she almost didn't hear his words. "Of course I remember," he said, barely changing his intonation. Sarah exhaled, trying to hide her growing anxiety. Her thoughts were racing back and forth again, settling on one thing: why was he acting like this? What is hidden behind his silence? Why did she keep feeling this strange but persistent chill that was gradually becoming more pronounced? The day passed slowly, and once again she couldn't find the strength to address the question that was growing stronger in her chest. It was as if she was afraid to hear the truth, afraid to see something in his eyes that would completely destroy the picture of the world in which she had lived for so long. When evening came, Sarah tried to be in a normal mood, but it was difficult for her to control herself. The friends they were meeting noticed that the atmosphere at the table had changed. Talking about vacations, which had once been a fascinating topic for them, now seemed empty and irrelevant, as if an invisible wall had appeared between them and those with whom they were talking. Thomas participated in the conversation, but his thoughts seemed to be somewhere far away. There was no warmth or sincere interest in it, only fatigue and inexpressible longing. "Is everything okay? You seem a little distracted," one of Sarah's friends suddenly asked, giving her a quick glance. Thomas glanced at her, but his response was as perfunctory as anything he had said to her that evening. "Yes, it's fine, I'm just a little tired," he replied, but his voice sounded somehow too even, too neutral, and Sarah felt a cold step run down her spine. This emptiness in his words was deceptive, and there was some kind of threat in it. Sarah could feel his attention rapidly drifting away, and when he returned to his conversation with one of the men at the table, she felt his presence become alien and distant. After dinner, when the guests had left and silence filled their house again, Sarah decided that she could no longer postpone the conversation. She had to find out everything, directly and without deception, because the fear she had been living with for the last few days could no longer be ignored. "Thomas," she began, coming up to him when, as usual, he sat down in an armchair, engrossed in his phone. "I need to talk to you." He looked up from the screen and looked at her. There was no surprise or fear in his gaze, just a kind of lingering silence. He knew that this moment would come, and now his face was still the same as she had seen it lately, aloof and frowning. "Is something wrong?" "What is it?" he asked, as if cautiously, but his voice did not betray any emotion. Sarah took a deep breath. At that moment, she felt all the tension building up in her body, as each heartbeat became clear and sharp. It was more than just a conversation. It was like being confronted with a reality that was impossible to escape. "It seems to me that something is wrong," she said, looking into his eyes. "You're not what you used to be. You're at work all the time, and I feel like you're hiding something." Thomas didn't seem to expect such a direct question. His face instantly became more tense, and his eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't answer right away, but only looked away for a moment, as if trying to find answers to his own questions. "It's just a job, Sarah," he said, but there was no confidence in his voice. "You're thinking too much." She felt something tense inside her. These words sounded like a familiar excuse, which she had already heard several times. But now they sounded like a prepared phrase, devoid of sincerity. "You don't have to tell me, but I'll know anyway," she said, feeling the pain building in her chest. Why can't you just tell me the truth?" His gaze darted to the side, and he took another sip of water before answering. "There's nothing worth explaining," he said, avoiding her eyes. Sarah could no longer contain her doubts. She knew there was more to his words than just work or fatigue. It was more than he could or would not tell her. But she was ready to hear the truth. Or perhaps she was ready to accept it, even if it would be painful for her. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that everything in their relationship was starting to crumble, as if the solid bricks on which she had built her life were beginning to crumble one by one. The morning did not bring relief. On the contrary, each morning event seemed more saturated with hidden meaning, as if everything was happening according to some pre-prepared program unknown to her. Thomas was especially silent in the morning. His eyes were looking out the window, but he didn't seem to see anything around him. This look, infinitely detached and absorbed in his inner world, remained with him even in moments of communication, in moments when they should have been close. Everything was too wary, too cold, and Sarah felt that this shadow was not disappearing, but becoming more and more intrusive, haunting her with every step. She sat in the kitchen and checked the bank transactions, trying not to think about what it might cause her inner anxiety. But as soon as her gaze fell on the latest credit card transactions, her heart sank with anxiety. Among the usual purchases, such as trips to the supermarket and utility bills, she saw several large sums that had been transferred to an unknown account. The recipient's address wasn't familiar, but the name, Victoria, seemed to echo in her head, like something she hadn't had time to get used to yet. Sarah tried to ignore her anxiety, but her thoughts would not let her go, rubbing more and more weight on her shoulders. Victoria. Who was she? Sarah felt a lump of envy and fear rise in her throat. She tried to hide her reaction, hoping it was just a mistake, a coincidence, but her hands started shaking as she checked the account information over and over again. These transfers were made from her card, from her money, and all for the sake of some woman whose name she did not know. And then Sarah realized that she could no longer remain blind to this secret. Later, when evening fell and Thomas returned home, Sarah tried to remain calm, but there was something in her eyes that could not go unnoticed. He felt that gaze, heavy and penetrating, and stopped in the doorway, as if he had suddenly been stunned by something. He took off his coat, but did not approach her. He just stood there and stared at her in disbelief. He couldn't understand what was going on, what had changed in him. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he said. His voice was soft, but unnecessarily tense. He already knew that something was wrong. His intuition told him that everything could be ruined now. Sarah raised her head without taking her eyes off him. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tried to find the right words. "I saw the transfers to your card, to Victoria's account." The name came out of her mouth like a shot, precise and ruthless. Thomas froze. He couldn't hide the fright that ran across his face, and it was more terrifying than any of his silent answers. He looked away, and she felt his shoulders tighten at that look, as if he himself was completely overwhelmed by what she had discovered. He tried to regain control of himself quickly, but it was obvious that he wasn't ready for such a conversation. "It's not what you're thinking, Sarah," he said, his voice getting low, as if he was trying to drown out something that was much heavier than empty excuses. "It seemed to you that you misunderstood everything. Victoria. It's just, you shouldn't take it that way." But Sarah no longer believed his words. She saw his reaction, felt how his every gesture became unnatural, how his words, which she might have believed before, were now perceived as empty mutterings. Thomas was a man who didn't know how to lie, but now he was doing it, and he was doing it badly, and his lies didn't have enough weight to believe them. "Victoria," she repeated, coming closer, "do you want to tell me anything? Why is she getting money from my card? Tell me the truth, Thomas. Why are you wasting our money on a stranger? What's going on between you two?" Silence filled the space between them. She could almost hear his breathing getting faster, as he tried to find words that wouldn't sound like a confession of what he had been hiding for a long time. He stood up, but could not meet her eyes. He looked at the floor and finally said, "I didn't want to tell you. But, yes. Victoria, she's not just in my life. It's more complicated than you think." Sarah felt something snap inside her. She took a step back, almost unable to process his words. It was worse than she could have imagined. It wasn't just the mistake or a misunderstanding. It was more than that. "How long have you been?" She couldn't finish her sentence. It was painful. "It hurts too much." Thomas was silent. His silence was the clearest confession. He couldn't say more than what had already been said. He was sitting with his head down, and at that moment Sarah felt the hopelessness of the situation. This money, these transfers, this name, everything stood up in her mind like a cruel puzzle, which was now being assembled into something completely hateful and alien. There was no more room in her life for the usual confidence, and she realized that she could not return to the world that existed before this revelation. Sarah stared at him, trying to figure out what to do next, but inside, everything seemed destroyed. The shadow of deception that had been hovering around their relationship for a long time was now becoming clear and distinct. Sarah woke up the next morning feeling empty. All evening she had been going over the dialogue with Thomas in her head, trying to figure out how, out of simple gullibility, she had ended up on the edge of the abyss. With every new word, with every glance, it was as if he himself was digging a hole under their relationship, and she, like a blind woman, trusted him, continued to step forward, not seeing how the ground was crumbling under her feet. There were no excuses for what she had learned, and yet, some remnant of hope made her believe that everything could still be taken back. But his every excuse, his every word, now sounded unconvincing, like an empty sound bouncing off a wall of silence. However, despite all the pain, Sarah couldn't ignore the thought that she still didn't know the whole truth. His looks, his evasiveness in his answers, his desire to avoid questions, all this led to disturbing reflections. He didn't say anything about how long he had been involved with Victoria, he didn't tell her exactly what connected them, and, most importantly, he didn't explain why she had to witness this lie without being warned that their relationship could collapse so easily. This gap in information became the very stone that weighed on the chest. Sarah knew she couldn't stop there. She had to find out the truth, she had to see everything, no matter how hard it was. By evening, she had made her decision. Her plan was simple, to keep an eye on. Watch his every move that might betray his intentions. She was going to be a quiet shadow, invisible and persistent, study his behavior and find clues that might be able to prove that her feelings and intuition were right. Sarah was ready for this. She couldn't afford to live in ignorance, in the blind belief that everything would work itself out. That evening, when Thomas returned home, she did not immediately approach him. Sarah waited until he was sitting on the couch, staring at his phone. She stood by the window, feeling the tension building up inside her. His gaze was invisible to her, he was absorbed in something of his own, something alien. And she silently waited for that moment to come, when he would be alone with her again, and his secrets would no longer be hidden. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Thomas asked, looking up, but his tone was restrained, a little wary, as if he intuitively knew that he would not be able to avoid conversations that should have been said long ago. Sarah stopped. Her face remained calm, but a storm was throbbing in her soul. She didn't answer right away. She wasn't going to reveal her secret. All she needed to do now was to watch. To see how he would react to her every gesture, every word. She felt that his calmness was only at first glance, that his thoughts at that moment were much further away than they might seem. "Don't you trust me, Sarah?" he said, putting the phone aside, as if to emphasize that now all his concentration is on her. His question sounded like some kind of hidden reproach, but Sarah knew it wasn't genuine concern, but rather a defensive reaction. He was trying to regain control that he had lost long ago. Sarah looked at him. Her words wouldn't be so important if she didn't feel that everything that was happening was just part of a game in which each of them was playing a role. "Thomas," she began slowly, "I trust you. But how much longer can I turn a blind eye to what's going on between us? How long do you think I'm going to sit and put up with you building your life behind my back?" Thomas curled his lips, as if trying to hide something. He didn't say a word. His silence was the clearest proof that all his self-confidence, all his words that he would never betray, were false. I can't believe what you're telling me," she continued, feeling her heart grow heavy. "You're living your life, and I just don't know who you really are." Thomas didn't know what to say. He was looking at her, but his eyes weren't sincere. At some point, Sarah realized that everything she was trying to do, to find out the truth, to regain her confidence, made no sense. He had been hiding from her for a long time, and no matter how long she waited, the truth would not come out unless he wanted to tell her himself. She decided not to wait any longer. "I'll keep an eye on you, Thomas. And if you think I'm going to sit around and blindly believe while you keep hiding your secrets, you're wrong. I need to know the truth." He looked shocked, his face pale. Thomas got up from his seat and walked to the window, standing with his back to her. "You don't understand what you're doing." His voice became shaky like never before. "If you keep doing this, you'll only ruin everything we had." Sarah felt everything rising in her, every nerve, every cell of her body demanding action. She couldn't let him shut up, couldn't let herself believe the lies he kept telling her. "Am I destroying everything?" "What is it?" she asked cautiously, repeating his words as if they were not hers, but his. "You ruined everything yourself, Thomas. And now you want me to stay here, closing my eyes and being silent?" His shoulders slumped, but he didn't turn to her. His silence was the loudest response. Sarah realized that she was on the verge of a decision. She had a goal, she had to get answers, even if she had to go through pain and disappointment to do it. And so, that evening, with a cold look and without unnecessary words, Sarah made a decision. She was going to follow him, she was going to find out everything. No matter what he thought of her actions, she could no longer afford to remain in the dark. Time passed slowly, as if the clock had lost its usual rhythm, when Sarah, filled with determination, began to act on her plan. Every day, every moment when she watched Thomas, seemed like a new stage in a game in which she was not ready to lose. She learned to be invisible, as if she were dissolving into space, merging with its familiar surroundings. Every movement, every gesture of her husband made her tremble, but she held back her emotions, clenching her fists, feeling each time how this fear and pain became a part of her. Her feelings fluctuated between the desire to find out the truth and the realization that knowing this truth could destroy the remnants of her world. But every glance, every evasive answer from Thomas only strengthened her resolve. She followed his phone calls, his unexpected trips, and how often he spent nights away from home now. Every time he tried to explain his behavior, his words failed to convince her. Sarah didn't believe him. He was a master of lies, and his empty promises now could not restore the trust that had been destroyed. As time passed, Sarah felt that she was getting closer to the moment when she would have to face him face to face. Her heart was beating fast when one evening, while checking his email, she noticed a strange message that made her heart skip a beat. It was short and contained only a few words: "Everything is ready, see you soon, Victoria." She felt a chill growing in her chest, as a veil of despair began to fall over her eyes. This simple phrase was like a bolt out of the blue, and Sarah, unable to take it anymore, decided that the moment of revelation had come. When Thomas came home, he had the same usual carefree smile on his face, but Sarah knew that he hadn't noticed in her gaze what was hiding under the surface. At this moment, she was not just a wife, but a woman who was about to reveal his secret. She stood in front of him, feeling her heart pounding, and raised the question that had been tormenting her all this time. "Thomas," she said calmly, despite the storm that was raging in her chest. You promised me honesty. You promised not to hide the truth. He stopped, squinting, as if trying to figure out what was behind her words. But there was something new in his gaze, nervousness, a hidden anxiety that he could not hide. Sarah, his voice was quiet, but there was a defensive note in it. What are you talking about? Sarah clutched the phone in her hands, handing him this message that she had been trying to ignore for so long. She saw how his face paled, how his fingers trembled slightly as he began to read these words. He paused, and at that moment, Sarah realized that he wasn't going to make excuses. Everything had been said a long time ago, and now all he had to do was admit it. Victoria. His voice traitorously cracked. I didn't mean to. I thought you'd never know. Her gaze did not move from his face. It wasn't just a confession. It was more than that. It was a confession that put an end to their relationship without requiring further words. So that's who she is, Sarah whispered, her voice cold and strained. Who is she really, Thomas? How could you? You didn't just cheat on me, you cheated on me all the time. You've been building your life on lies while I've been putting up with it all. Thomas lowered his head, his arms hung limply by his side. He was stunned, not knowing what to say. He thought that he could avoid this moment, that he could somehow manipulate the situation, hiding his guilt behind the words that everything is not as it seems. But now it wasn't. I do not know how to explain this, Sarah, he said, his voice trembling. I was wrong, I got confused. That wasn't my goal. I didn't mean to hurt you. Sarah felt her heart break at those words. He couldn't even tell the truth. He couldn't admit that he had been hiding her from reality all this time, building illusions around her. He couldn't admit that the love she surrounded him with was just a convenient mask for him. She heard his excuses, but they didn't reach her. All the words about being confused were empty. She couldn't believe that this man she loved, who had been a part of her life for so many years, had become a stranger. You're not confused, Thomas, her words were as sharp as a knife. You chose this path. You chose this woman, this lie. You chose betrayal. And I can't live with that. Tears glistened in his eyes, and Sarah felt a pang of pain in her soul. He was guilty, and she knew she would never be able to forgive him. He was a stranger, even if he was on his knees in front of her, and she couldn't believe his words anymore. I understand that this is the end, Sarah. His voice was almost slurred, but there was the same determination in it with which she had previously spoken about their lives. But I needed to say it. I couldn't hide the truth anymore. She stood as if petrified, and did not know what to say. She no longer felt love, she no longer felt affection. All she felt was a sense of emptiness and inevitability. She couldn't stay with him, she couldn't go back to that world where there was confidence and trust. You've ruined everything, she whispered. But now I have to move on, Thomas. I can't be with you anymore. Sarah turned, not looking at him. She didn't want to see his face. She didn't want to hear any more of his excuses. He was no longer a part of her world. Sarah stood at the window, looking out into the dark night, as if into an abyss into which her thoughts, her dreams and hopes were disappearing. The streetlights shone weakly on the street, their dim light reflected off the wet sidewalks, and the world seemed to her as gray and meaningless as her life, which was now divided into before and after. In this silence, broken only by the occasional footsteps of passers-by, she tried to sort out her feelings, but the more she thought, the more confused she became about her own emotions. She couldn't immediately understand what she was feeling. The pain of betrayal throbbed in her chest, but there was something else behind it: confusion, a heaviness that wouldn't let go of her. How could you lose everything so quickly? How could she have ended up at this point, where now all her efforts, all her years together didn't matter? And most importantly, how could she continue to live with it if there were so many options? Thomas, whom she had once considered a part of her life, a part of herself, was now just a shadowy figure whose words and deeds had lost all meaning. He wasn't the man she could build a future with. He was the one who destroyed everything she held dear. But at the same time, this man was still the one she had once loved. This knowledge brought pain, but it tore her soul even more. Love and betrayal, trust and lies, everything was intertwined in her mind, not giving her the opportunity to find clarity. Sarah understood that now her life would be different from what it had been before. But what should she do? She couldn't leave him without an answer. That would be too easy. But it was also impossible to return to him. There were too many wounds, too many lies. To be with him now would mean continuing to live in the shadow of his betrayal, leaving her soul trapped in invisible chains. And here, in this dark night, for the first time she began to feel that her strength lay not in choosing between him and the future, but in finding her own path, independent of him, a path that she could choose for herself. The phone rang, but Sarah didn't answer. She knew who was on the other side. Thomas was probably trying to justify himself again, trying to explain something again. But her gut told her that every call he made was another attempt to bring her back to a world she could no longer accept. Her feelings had changed. She could no longer be someone who gave herself entirely into the hands of another person, even if that person had once been close to her. All she knew now was that she had to free herself from this burden that was dragging her to the bottom. The next morning, when Thomas was trying to find her gaze again, and his hands were reaching for her, Sarah felt a strange, almost painful detachment. She was aware that his touch no longer brought her warmth. Instead, in his touch, she felt the weight of his guilt, his deception, which could no more be erased than the marks of deep cuts. He was silent, not knowing what to say. He came, as always, with a desperate attempt to establish at least some kind of contact, but his words no longer meant anything to her. Sarah. His voice was brittle, full of pain, but not sincerity. Please listen to me. I want to fix everything. You know I love you. It was just one moment of weakness. You have to understand how hard it is for me without you. Sarah stared at him, but couldn't find the strength to respond. How could she believe his words if they were as empty as all the promises he had once made? How could she forgive him if he continued to be the one who destroyed their world? Something tightened in her chest, and she realized that now, at this stage, her choice was not only to be with him or without him. It was a decision that concerned herself, her inner world, and her future. I can't accept this, Thomas, she finally replied, her voice low but determined. You ruined everything that was between us. You destroyed us. I can't just forget it. I can't go back to being the one who believes your words. I can't go back to this world. He lowered his head, but Sarah noticed that his hands were shaking slightly. He wanted to say something again, but he couldn't. She understood that words couldn't change anything anymore. Everything was said, and it was impossible to fix it. Their relationship, their love, their life, it was all ruined now. And although the pain of this loss was unbearable, Sarah knew that it was the only right decision. She couldn't go back to the way it was. Sarah took a step back, as if distancing herself not only from him, but also from her past. She knew that the unknown awaited her, but in this unknown she was ready to find herself. She looked at him and felt her resolve strengthen. She was no longer connected to this man. Her life now belonged to her. I need time to figure out what to do next, she said, and it was more than just words. It was an admission that she couldn't live in the fear and pain he brought. Her future didn't depend on him. She could rebuild her life, no matter what happened. Thomas didn't say anything in response. He couldn't say anything more. Sarah turned and left. There was no confidence in her step, but there was a calmness in her heart, strange, cold, but liberating. She was ready to move on, even if it meant walking alone. Sarah stood on the threshold of a new life, feeling the weight of the last weeks, months, and maybe even years gradually lifting off her shoulders. The whole period, full of disappointment and doubt, alienation and pain, now seemed to her something distant and almost unreal, like a fog that dissolves with the first ray of morning. She closed her eyes, listening to her thoughts, and felt her soul fill with a strange lightness. It wasn't a relief that it was finally over. It was a feeling that now there was only her own path ahead, without traces of other people's desires and aspirations. Thomas left, and Sarah felt no resentment. He left her alone, but she, in fact, was already alone, despite all their years together. Once she sincerely believed that they would create something unique, that their love would be protected from all storms and trials. But now she understood that love is not just words, not just moments of passion or spiritual unity. Love is primarily about respect, honesty, and willingness to live together, where both partners are equal and sincere with each other. And his infidelities destroyed that trust, erased those invisible but strong threads that bound their hearts. But Sarah wasn't inclined to feel sorry for herself. There was no longer the blind naivety in her eyes that once made her turn a blind eye to obvious things. She realized that behind her every step there was now a choice, a decision that she made on her own, without regard for other people's expectations and desires. And despite her pain, she was ready to move forward. There was nothing more valuable in this world than her own freedom, freedom from illusions, from lies, from everything that deprived her of the opportunity to be herself. That evening, she was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, with a cup of tea in her hands, looking at the same street that she and Thomas had once watched together, building dreams about the future. Sarah looked at her differently now. In this city, in these streets, she was no one's shadow, no one's soulmate. She was a whole world to herself, a world that needed to be rediscovered and loved. The gray light of the passing day that covered the house reminded her that everything that was important and present was now in the past, and the future, whatever it might be, had not yet been written. At that moment, the phone rang, and her heart, not immediately catching the familiar melody, let the sound pass through itself, as if it were some kind of new harbinger. She hesitated to answer. What else could Thomas have said to her? She didn't want to hear his voice full of frustration and helplessness again. But this call wasn't from him. It was the number of her sister, Maria, with whom she had not spoken for quite a long time, absorbed in personal problems. But now, in this new state, free and cleansed of old connections, she felt she had to talk to her. "Hi," Maria's voice sounded with notes of concern and curiosity, as if she felt that some kind of turning point had occurred in Sarah's life. "How are you?" Sarah closed her eyes, letting go of the heavy thought, and quietly replied, "Hello. It's okay, Maria. Everything will be fine." There was a pause for a moment, and Sarah felt her sister slip into her world, as if searching for something hidden that she could understand. "Are you sure?" Maria's voice was soft, but there was a hint of anxiety in it. "I know how hard it was for you. I told you once that you shouldn't have put up with all this, that he would never be the one you deserve. You've always lived for others, Sarah." Sarah clutched the cup in her hands, feeling her heart fill with something new, not pain, but strength. It was a discovery, quiet and inconspicuous, but already of great value. She finally felt that she was her own meaning. And now, even if the world was falling apart, she could be sure of one thing: she would create her own reality, and only she would decide what would happen to her next. "Yes, I'm sure," Sarah replied, quietly but firmly. "I can't change what happened, but I can definitely decide what will happen next. And I will be strong, Maria. Because I am the main one in my life." Her words, uttered with such sincere determination, sounded like a revelation, and she realized that they weren't just addressed to her sister. These words were said to myself, first of all. Now that Thomas had disappeared from her life, she could start living the way she wanted, without looking back at other people's mistakes and illusions. "I'm proud of you, Maria said, and there was a note of pride in her voice that Sarah couldn't help but feel. You're strong, I've always known that. Sarah smiled, feeling warmth spread through her body for the first time in a long time. She was ready to start a new life. A life in which there was no room for deception, lies, or other people's expectations. She was ready to take the first step into a world that belonged only to her. And maybe there was a new love waiting for her, new horizons, but that wasn't important right now. Right now, the most important thing for her was herself.